Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We welcome you to another episode of Race Matters. Today is Wednesday, August 31st, 2022. So, unfortunately, our main host, Sharon, is not able to join us for tonight's episode. But Rosie, Egypt, and myself, I am Mariana, will share with you some of the current events that have been happening and that pertain to racial matters. So, before we get started, please take a moment and share this link where you see us now, either your YouTube link or Facebook, so we can spread the word about our conversations, which we believe are very important. Also, we love it when you join us in our conversations. So please, any questions or comments you might have, share them on the feed. We'll see them and we'll engage with them. So yeah, that's for the introductions for today. And as I shared, we have some current events, some quite major, others similar to other things that have happened in the past. And we would want to address that as a team and talk about them. So with that in mind, I'll pass it to Rosie, who will share our first story tonight.
Yes, good evening, everyone. And again, we're looking forward to talking to you about different things, dealing with race matters, because this is a safe place to have the conversation and not feel judged or not feel like you're being looked at any kind of way. Because we all have our own feelings and opinions, and we like to share them, and we like people to share theirs without thinking you're going to be judged about it, because we all have different views and opinions. And I'm going to be talking, one of the subjects I'm going to be talking about, because a lot of times we highlight some stories on injustices that Black men and women have when dealing with authority, when dealing with cops and being pulled over and stuff. But today I want to talk about the flip side, how it's so important for good cops to do the good things, do the right things, and we want to make sure you understand that just because we talk about certain current events that deals with the injustices that have been hidden for so many years because social media wasn't there to capture it, and so many injustices that happen with people being arrested that shouldn't have been, and how they get charged and things like that. That does not mean that we're saying all cops are bad and all cops are doing things. So recently I was looking at a clip of a police officer. Now I'm going to say his name, and it's funny to me because it was a white police officer who was called out to a situation. And he got out the car immediately screaming and yelling and stuff. And when I saw his name, I was like, oh my gosh, why that name? Because his name is actually David Duke. Anybody knows that name, have any kind of association with that name, knows what the name David Duke solidifies back in like the 60s era and stuff. And of course today too, backing Donald Trump, stuff. Because David, a lot of people like, is David Duke still alive? Yes, alive and well. But this officer, he was just a police officer in uniform. And when they said his name, and his first name was David and his last name was Duke, I said, oh God, what a name to have and a situation to be caused with you. And
can I question, how old is Mr. David Duke, the officer?
The officer, now, it didn't say how old he was, but from the look of it, I would say he wasn't older than me. Now I'm in my 50s, my late 50s. I would say this gentleman, I would say he was between 40 to 45. David Duke is way older than me. We all know he's more like Trump, close to Trump's age. Go ahead.
The reason why I asked the question is because I was curious as if to, obviously I don't know him personally, but if his parents had named him intentionally David because of who actual David Duke is. Just a thought before we get into
it. That is a very good
thought. Valid question.
That is a very good thought. And you'll see me looking sideways a couple times because I have my notes here, guys. And I'm not as savvy as the rest, so I don't have stuff directly in front of me, just in case. But I look sideways. That's just me looking at my notes. But there were two officers there. There were a number of officers pulled to the scene. But the scary part was the bad cop, Mr. Duke, screaming and yelling. And as he approached the two Black gentlemen that he was screaming and yelling at, the older gentleman had gotten on his hands and knees because he came out with his hands up and he was like, come right over here, get down on the ground. And then As he walked over to the gentleman, he put his foot on the middle of his back and slammed him into the ground, busting his forehead. His forehead was bleeding and everything. But I don't want to just look at what this officer did. There were two officers there, a Sergeant Aquila Paulador. I can't pronounce the name, but it was a black female officer, and she was a sergeant. And then there was a white female officer, Brandy Smith. Now, what dawned on me is these two female officers weren't going to let this happen and go down without it being addressed. And it was crazy because even though Officer Duke kept talking about what the black man did, he said he wasn't listening. He came around the car, he had a weapon in his hand, then he got rid of it and he put his hands in his pocket and he was coming toward me with his hands in his pocket. And I was afraid for my life. But, I don't understand how you come off like that with your body cam on.
Right.
Because they watched the man walking like this the whole time. And he said he was yelling at him to drop his weapon. And you could see in the body cam, he never mentioned a weapon. He just told him, get down. The good thing is, as soon as the black sergeant showed up, she looked at the situation and she pulled another officer who I think was a sergeant or something like that, pulled him to the side. And according to the reports that they wrote, she pulled him to the side and said, something don't seem right here. This don't look good. Now, this was the black officer. The white officer, female officer, was on the scene. Brandy was on the scene with the other cop that was doing the abuse. And you could even see with her that she was a little bit like tense, like she wasn't sure if you could see she was uncomfortable. But she wasn't going to challenge the other officer. So I don't know how long she was on the force. In the end, when they take the officer takes the gentleman to the police car and he's explaining what happened, and the black sergeant, she walked over and the gentleman was telling the EMTs, he slammed me to the ground, he hit my head on the ground. And when a friend of the gentleman who was injured came over to Officer Duke and he said, excuse me, officer, can I have your card? He said, oh, we don't have cards. They don't give us cards. We don't have cards. And the black sergeant, she was like, you could see her face. She looked up. I'm talking to Ebony because I want to see if sometimes we can bring videos in so they could see what we're talking about. But if you see her facial expressions, she was like, what is he saying? And when the young man went to walk away, she said, don't go anywhere. We've got cards. And she's pulling her card out at the same time. The young officer, Brandy, she also pulled her cards out and gave it to him. And then if you read the reports, Brandy and the sergeant, neither one of them pulled the punches. They told what happened. And he said, and Officer Duke said the way that the gentleman hit the ground was he fell on top of him. He tried to hold him and they got into a scuffle and they fell on the ground together. Yet his body cam showed him slamming this gentleman to the ground. Brandy said she witnessed him put his foot on the middle of the man's back and slam him to the ground.
Wow. I think
go ahead.
I'm sorry. I think a lot of times when things like that happen, it's an intentional abuse of power. I think that oftentimes it strokes one's ego to seem as though they have some type of jurisdiction over a person, because that gives them a level of power that they may not have in their household or in their family, or they didn't grow up with that certain identity that they're trying to cultivate now. So I think that that's one thing to look at when we're hiring police. Another huge thing is I think that it was very important that there was a black officer on scene at that time. And I say that because it shows that if more of us get into these fields or these spaces that will allow our counterparts to be held accountable, then maybe we can start to see change, and maybe that we can start to subjugate the change that we want to see internally so that it can happen externally. And so I hope that does encourage more people to want to become officers, to want to become attorneys, to want to become in the field that is created to protect the citizens of the United States. And hopefully we can grow from this. But I also think that there are sometimes people of color that do get into these positions and get tricked into having that same power trip
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm,
is had. I mean, you've seen it before. Like even when you watch films and they talk about slaves that might have gotten inside of the house and now they're looking down on the slaves that are out in the field.
Right.
How do you create a place where instead of it being as though that's the case, we look at to overthrow, or not even necessarily overthrow, but change things
right.
that are
Mhm.
stuck in ways that aren't of this time frame.
Right.
So
Yeah.
shout outs to her as as
Mhm.
an officer, and not only as a black officer, but as a female officer. But
Right.
then on top of that, just like it's good to know that there are good cops, and I don't want to think and put out to the world that there are only bad cops, but those
Mm-hmm.
bad apples can make a bunch seem rotten. So shout
Absolutely.
outs to her though.
Yeah, and that's exactly what it means that this is a systemic issue, right? And in that video, the guy who was reporting on this was highlighting how oftentimes what makes other cops approach people like that is the fear of retaliation, right? So like
Mm-hmm.
that, the fear will play a role in the systemic, issue in this case of not approaching. So she took a risk, and it was quite a big risk because she could have been targeted by him
Well,
afterwards.
and on top of that, I think we're entering in an era where officers are no longer going to be afraid to say what you're doing is wrong
Mhm.
and start to address it, because Egypt is right. When black cops were first being pulled on the force, it wasn't to be police officers. It was just to police your own people, because black police officers, when they first started getting hired, and I'm only saying this because a movie I saw about some of the first cops that were hired, they weren't allowed to approach white people and stop them and detain them or nothing, because when they did, then the white person would say, "Who do you think you are? You are nobody." And then if white officers came, they would tell the white officers, "You better tell this, who he's messing with," because you were only being trained to detain and hurt and attack, like Egypt's talking about. You got the house slaves and the field ones. The house slaves were above the field slaves, so they looked down on them. Then they made them look down on them. And that's the same thing with policing. Now we are getting into an area where that has to shift, where not only black police officers, but good police officers. Because Brandy, she's a white female, but you could tell she was troubled with what she was seeing. Now the difference was Brandy was afraid to speak up. The sergeant, she wasn't. But she wasn't afraid to give her report and everything. And like you all said, there's a brotherhood type of thing where you keep everything within us, and it doesn't matter anymore of gender. If you're one of us, you keep your mouth shut. And you could tell by the way that Mr. Duke was talking, because when he said they don't give us cards, and I think he expected the black sergeant to not go against what he said. To keep it quiet. But she said her face changed, and she looked at him, and she told the young man, no, don't go nowhere. And she looked at David Duke, and she said, "We have cards." And she got hers out, and Brandy handed hers over, and they gave it to him. And she asked Mr. Duke, the officer Duke, she said, "What is your badge number?" And she wrote everything down. But if you looked at her facial expression, it was saying volume to him. And 2 days later, he was fired. And a few days later, he's looking at charges that could give him 10 years in prison. But that's what happens when good cops start to confront the abusive cops that use their badge and their uniform. Because I say this all the time, some cops, they're just trading their Klan uniform for a blue uniform, and when they go home, they put the blue uniform on back in the closet and they put their Klan one back on. And this way we've got people filtering out this. When we always talk about these good cops have to stand up and they have to address this, they're coming out. Because I'm only talking about one, but I watched a number of them a number of them, where the good cops came over and said, well, why you got this young 14-year-old sitting in the back of the car? Well, he had possession of a stolen motorcycle. Yeah, but are you charging him? Has he done anything wrong? Well, no, it's just that he has possession. He says he has the bill of sale. And the guy was like, yeah, but he's 14 years old. Now, this is a white cop with a white cop. He said, but he's 14 years old. He said, I have when I was growing up, I was younger than him. I had all kind of ATVs and stuff. I never had titles for them. I never had to show papers. He said, he's 14. He said, it's no reason for you to have him handcuffed in the back of a car. Well, I was going to, charge him with this. Are you going to charge him? Well, not really. Well, then let the young man go. His father is here, and as they said, it's because my son is Black. And even though the young man wasn't doing anything wrong, and he said, yes, sir, I bought a bike off of somebody. I have to build a sale now. Put your hands behind your back, and I'm throwing him in the back of the car.
And you see the tone, and that tone is very clear from the beginning too in this video, right? That from the beginning, with the approach that he came was very aggressive, even though they're following. Because you could see both of the individuals in this video going to the ground and following the waters, and he was still very aggressive in his approach.
And even when
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, Egypt, go.
I think that's why a huge reason as to why we question the law is because who's policing the police?
Right.
They're not going to always abide by the rules they're supposed to abide by. But if they're the only ones who lie down the rules for everybody to abide by, who is policing them? And when they're only policing each other, if I had the choice to not tell on the person that I'm friends with or I work with, I probably won't, because we have, so like you said, a sense of brotherhood,
community,
a bond, community. So I think that it's important that when you do have the good cops, since they are with an internal brotherhood or band thereof, it's important that they do call each other out, because if they don't, me just saying it, I just sound like another person complaining about the system, as opposed to somebody that's inside saying, no, there are things that need to be changed. There are people that are actually tainted, and they're tainting the reputation of what we actually are trying to stand for. Because to be clear, the reason as to why it was started, why the police was started, was slave patrol.
Absolutely.
So the reasons as to why policing is an actual thing, hopefully it's transcending into something a little bit more positive and beneficial to the environment and to the community. But let's not get it twisted. The intent was never to be pure. It was always to control. And if we are going to do it, how can we cultivate a brotherhood or a policing that is actually safe and beneficial, not only for the officers, but the citizens at large? So I think that's important to figure out who is policing the police, and how can we end up making it a safe space for everybody.
Right. And when you see in this case and in others that it makes a difference when there is, policing of the police, right? Holding accountability matters, right? And I actually saw a study, I don't know if, I'm sure it's no surprise to the two of you, but I saw studies that were saying that when a Black officer is on scene with other officers going into a Black neighborhood, the chance of violence geared towards people of color decreases significantly. Is that something that you heard about before?
Well, I don't know about Egypt, but it's nothing that I've heard about. It's something that I've experienced. And it's because when I'm from Camden, when you're in Camden, when Black police officers approach you, you want to run to them and tell them your story, because you don't fear the threat there. They're you and you're them. And usually in Camden, when I see police officers approaching people, the community that they're a part of, and they don't approach a situation with guns drawn and screaming and yelling. Matter of fact, when a police officer, usually when Black police officers, Puerto Rican police officers, even white police officers in Camden show up, they're usually, hey, is everything okay? And they're talking to them. And that's why Camden police have been spearheaded lately a lot in how the policing system has changed in Camden, because they know the community. And usually they walk up on the scene. They don't start shooting and acting crazy until they see something happening and shooting craziness is going on. But usually in Camden, when I see police officers pull up, They're just asking questions. Hey, is everything all right here? And they don't come. You don't feel threatened. You don't feel like you're being profiled. You don't feel none of that. You see the officer and you know, yo, bro, we might not call him officer, this and that. Yo, bro, this man. And because we feel comfortable.
Yeah, I think that there was a huge switch. I frequent Camden when I'm home. A lot of my friends live in Camden. And I think that one of the biggest changes that I saw was that the officers were stationed in certain sections in Camden. So where they're standing outside. So they're getting a chance to interact with the community. They're getting a chance to talk to one another. So it does create a sense of community in between the two, which allows for them to be able to have dialect and dialogue that makes people feel comfortable. So I think that in and itself is important, and that's probably why they're starting to see less crime rate in the city of Camden.
Yeah, and a lot of the police officers are walking the streets. That, like Egypt said, they're not riding in their cars and sitting around corners and waiting to catch somebody. They're usually walking up and down the streets, talking to people. I showed up at one location one time. I was doing Lyft or Uber, one of the two at the time. And I pulled up in a section of Camden that I know very well. You know, my family lives out there and stuff. And they had just stopped an ice cream truck. The kids were getting ready to get off the bus for school. And they positioned the ice cream truck right there. And as the kids were getting off the school bus, they were calling the kids over and buying ice cream for all the kids that were getting off the bus. They were buying ice cream for the parents. I even put it on Facebook. I was recording it and putting it on Facebook. But the kids aren't afraid of the police officers. Yeah. Just like a little girl that they showed on Facebook one time where a white police officer approaches, she bust out crying and asked him, "Are you going to shoot us?" You know, that's Camden kids. They're not like that. They see cops, they run toward them.
What a difference, right? And then, you know, within that, there's actually more influence, right?
Yes.
That you can have in a moment when there is a need for an intervention, right? That you have to like utilize your power, right? Your leadership role in the community, because people,
I don't want to hoard the whole.
No, it's a good conversation.
But this is a good conversation, and we can continue it later on. But Mariana, do you have a current event you want to talk about before we do the whole show on mine?
Well, I think that the second one will also give us plenty to discuss. But yes, the one I decided to cover today is the student loan forgiveness, because it's a major one that has a lot of people talking, right? So the reason I think it's important and it applies to our Race Matters show, right, is because although student debt affects all races, it especially affects lower income people, right? But it definitely has a bigger impact on BIPOC populations, and especially, Black Americans, and due to the disparity in wealth, right? So we know that from some of the research, Black and African American college students own, on average, at least $25,000 more than the average white student.
Wow.
And then 4 years after graduation, 48 of those Black students owe 12% more than when they borrowed, right? So because of all the interest rates, over time, the amount they owe increases and it doesn't decrease. Right. And this is when they pay at least $300 or so monthly. So they're making these payments for several years, and then the amount just continues to increase. And it's important to talk about it also because when students go to college, right, and communities of color, it's much harder to have support from the parents economically due to all the things that we addressed in previous shows, from like slavery to segregation to all the ways in which Black people were stopped and in many ways stolen from, right? So oftentimes Black parents are not able to support their children financially when they do decide to go to college. So yeah, this is a major one. Rosie, you're reacting when I was, saying some of that. Is that something that?
Well, no, but it's really important what you're saying, because even with I don't know, I don't know about anybody else, but in the communities I grew up in, you have most of the Black families are single mothers raising their kids.
Mhm.
The fathers and stuff are in jail for whatever, especially in when you look at it today. Back then, they might have had some weed or this and that and the other thing, and did some light drugs, and they've lost everything. A parent was an addict, and they not only ended up in jail, but lost their kids. They lost everything. Whereas today, the face of the addict has changed. So now they're
Mhm.
sick. They're not drug addicts.
Mhm.
They're not low lives. They're sick people.
Mhm.
But in those communities, when you don't, and this is just my opinion, and you all can let me know how you see it, but when you have communities that have a single parent, especially when it's the mother who is trying to raise children, and she doesn't have the finances to send her kids to school, so you are charged with and most of the time we couldn't even get a loan because we just were broke. We don't have any kind of credit. And you weren't even taught as a Black family back then
Mhm.
to learn how to have credit and things like that, so that you can build credit and then get loans and send your kids to college. So basically, when your kids were going to college, it was with grants and then with a whole bunch of loan debts. And there was no way. Whereas how I used to see it back then is that, unless you're a white family and you have a husband, father and mother raising your kids, you got good jobs, you can pay for your kids to go to college. And half the time you paid for them to get into different programs so that they got a free scholarship. Yet we were
Mhm.
getting the worst education, but had to work harder to make sure our kids get
Mhm.
good grades, with the possibility of them getting into college and getting all kind of debt. And you have a single parent that can't afford that.
Mhm.
And then, like you said, then for the rest of your life, you're stuck. Not the parent, but the child is ended up
Mhm.
stuck with the debt, because the parent, it was a single parent, and she was barely putting food on the table, so she couldn't even help her child
Right.
get
Right.
a loan or things like that. And
Mhm.
the psychological part of that is so detrimental, because even though you're doing your best, you just don't see the
The end
results
of it. Yeah.
that you see for others.
Mhm.
It's so many layers to the thought
Right.
process of student loan debt, and to underserved communities, then going to minorities, and why are they underserved? Why can't they afford to be
Exactly.
able to pay for their children to go to these colleges and
Yes.
universities? But then
Mhm.
looking at other places and other countries that are offering free education, and then you have to pay so much money for education because America thrives off debt.
Hmm.
So when you see these other countries thriving off of education, and thriving off of free education, or cheaper education, it begs the question: if America plans on being the best at everything, or number one in all aspects, which we're not, we're very much so behind in a lot of aspects, including education. How can you then expect to be number one as a country if you're charging an arm and a leg for education? Now, with that
Mhm.
being said, after that, let's talk about minorities or underserved communities and having to get their child to these institutions to be able to get a higher education.
Exactly.
They can't get the same type of grants because they don't have the same resources. They
Nope.
Absolutely.
don't have the same school backgrounds that has to be able to get the GPAs. And when their GPAs are weighted against private schools
Mhm.
that other students have the opportunity to go to because their parents can afford it, their GPA aren't weighted the same. So now they're not getting the same scholarships, or not getting the same opportunities to get a free education
Mhm.
or a cheaper education. So that's the first thing. So now they have to take out a bigger loan. And now they're
Right.
putting these loans in their name because they don't have messed up credit, because their parents may have messed up credit because they were trying to make things work for their children.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now
Mhm.
it's messing up their credit because when they get out of college and they get done an undergraduate degree, which is a 4-year degree, now you can't even get a job right out of undergrad because now you need a master's degree or you need a doctorate.
Right.
So now I
Mhm.
go back to school to stop my student loans from happening,
Mhm.
but I'm
Mhm.
accruing more debt. And now
Hmm.
the more debt
Absolutely.
I accrue, the more
Mhm.
that I have to work harder to get out of that
Mhm.
debt. But does my
Absolutely.
job pay the amount to me
Mhm.
to allow me the opportunity to get out of that
Right.
debt? Most of the
Right.
time, they probably don't, because then
Right.
I have to get a
Especially when
mortgage.
Mhm.
Hmm.
So it's like it's a continuum of debt, not to mention the car note. So not only I'm now paying a
Mhm.
mortgage, a car note, and my student loans. every dollar is going to go to these levels of debt that now, even though my salary says I should be able to get myself out of this debt, now I can't live a life at all because the only thing I'm focused on is paying towards this debt.
Right.
So it's a continuum of the cycle that they want to continue because it allows them to continue to get money and add interest on that money that they loan.
Exactly. Yeah, it's predatory behavior. And, you know, if we speak in terms of like then the potential for after graduation, right? So let's say that, Black people, especially Black women, did get through it, right? To be able to be in a position of power, usually there's a lot more that's being asked from you, right? Maybe like a master's and so on, in a way that like, a Black man would have been able to get that job much easier.
Yeah. And then that's what I think is so important for now, Mariana, you can, pull on this more, but what this debt relief program is trying to put forward, but it's still scary because who's going to be able to get those, are the children that come from my community in Camden and stuff like that, are they going to be the first ones? I mean, are they going to be participating in this? Because, we've seen in the past where they say everybody is going to be able to do this, but then because of where we come from, we're looked at last. So by the time our children apply for these grants or these programs to give us relief, their kids already took them. The parents who could afford to put their kids through college, they done already hit the system and taken the grants out or taken the things out for their children. And the system is going to say, oh, well, we can only do but so many. So how does that work? Because, it's still scary because you'll see people getting out of their debt. And it's like, yeah, but they could afford to pay for their debt, but my kids can't. Yet my kid, we tried to apply and everything we did, they kept saying we weren't eligible. So who's mining this whole thing to make sure it's across the board, or the ones that really, I don't want to sound like we're needy, but the ones who need it the most.
And absolutely.
It's not fair.
And there's a reason for the need, right? Because as we talked, you weren't given an equal chance to be able to like have that prior to all of this, right? So according to, what I've heard is that, we don't actually have to apply for the relief. The education, board has the information, and then they will just like subtract for every person who's applied. So that's 10,000 for those who make less than 125 a year. And the good thing about this is that 80% of that goes to people who make less than 70,000 a year.
Right.
And then, those who had a Pell Grant, which was like financial aid of some sort in college, those students will get an additional 10,000. So they will receive 20,000 total.
Right. But let me tell you, it still makes me scared because we've seen the system say it's going to help poor people all the time. I'm sure you come from and yet we are not receiving the help. And again, who is schooling? Who is making sure that it's done the right way? Because systematically, we've seen it happen where they say we're going to help you, and then we don't get the help.
And that makes sense.
What were you going to say, Egypt?
I was just going to say that these kind of things we know are definitely done intentional on not helping us specifically underserved communities, simply because if I know that you're going to struggle to pay me back, I want you to take money out because that gives me the opportunity to prolong and double down on the amount of debt or the amount of interest you're going to owe me, which means that if you can't pay me back, I can charge you more than what somebody who can pay me back would have to pay.
Right.
So it makes more sense for me to keep someone who is underprivileged and underserved in a bigger financial debt, because now they're going to have a longer time to pay me back, which is going to make me or allot me the opportunity to charge them more in interest. And that's why it's an intentional target on people that are underserved and and more importantly, people of color
Mhm.
to be able to have these type of struggles so that they can
Exactly.
continue to monetize on it.
Mhm. And it happens during a vulnerable age, right? Sometimes
Yeah.
students, they start taking these loans when they're 17. I don't think most of us at the age of 17 understand the consequences of like what it will look like. And I know a lot of people are getting angry, but also I think a lot of people are not realizing about the forgiveness, and they're not realizing just the predatory nature of how they're set up. And of course, I don't think this scratches the surface of the issues. I think there needs to be systemic issues addressed, like Egypt was talking about in terms of like where education is in US in terms of pricing versus other countries around the world. And it doesn't even have to be free, but at least, make it more affordable, because I don't know anyone almost who could afford, easily at that age, 30,000 a year, or in many cases a semester, right? And like, if we were to take the second country in the world whose like university system is most expensive after US,
Right.
probably like a third of what it is here.
Yeah.
And the other factor with this, with the $10,000, is that there's people who are paying these loans and they didn't even finish the degree. So now they have this debt, but they don't even have the degree that they could utilize. And if we were to like follow up about that, I'm sure again that might be the case, that it will be higher for vulnerable populations to be the ones who are not able to follow through because of those
1,000%.
sorts of risks.
I actually have friends that had to drop out of school because their
Wow.
credit score got so low and their parents'
Wow.
credit score was already messed up that they couldn't get a
Co-sign.
co-signer to be able to continue their matriculation through
Jesus.
school. I actually have one of my best friends. He literally had to retake all the classes that he took his first semester just to be able to graduate on time, because they took his they took all the grades he accumulated from his first semester away because he wasn't able to afford to pay the back balance for it. So again, these type of things are real, and just because it isn't someone else's reality, they negate it as if it is real, and as if it's not affecting people, and it's happening daily. People, and then on top of that, he was fortunate to be able to figure it out. There's people that, as you said, Mariana, that don't get the chance to finish to get their degree, and now they can't even utilize the debt utilize their degree to get out the debt that they're in. So now they acquire more debt to try to figure out more different avenues to try to make income or passive income. So it's a cycle that is going to always continue unless we figure out a way to create free education.
Right.
Because it's only going to help the country grow and make it better. So I don't understand why we can't find a balance, but also healthcare, like all these things that go on the spectrum. But we also understand that, again, we don't even invest the proper funding in our children's education. You talk about the education system in its entirety. Sorry, a bus is passing by. I'm outside in Louisiana right now. But you talk about the education system in its entirety. We don't even finance it with the proper numbers at a elementary level.
Right.
So why would we even think that they're going to do it at a collegiate level? It's interesting, and we got to do better.
And something you mentioned earlier about the education. I mean, we're a rich country, a rich nation. We've got all of this money, yet we can't afford to put our kids in, give them the free educations needed. The ones who argue about giving free education, we shouldn't be giving free education. Well, your kids ain't even paying for college because you're congressmen and women, and your children have free education. Your children get free education. You don't have to pay for any medical bills because we, the people, pay for your medical, and yet you don't want to give free medical to the people out here that are actually sick in poverty areas. And I remember watching one of the court, because I love watching court shows, and this young lady was in court with her mother. Her mother wanted her to pay certain debts back, and I think it was Judge Mathis, but he asked her, well, why ain't you in school? She said, because I'm from Canada. You can go to college all the way up until you're 30 years old for free. She said, when I moved here with my mother and then found out how much it cost to get an education, I decided that I'm dropping out. I'm not paying for it. When in my country, you can go, it's free all the way up until you're 30 years old. And that's the thing. It's like, you're acting like people aren't educatable. And that may be a crazy word, that may not be the correct word, but I'm using it. You're acting like people aren't educatable, but you're not even given the ability to see and try to be educated. Because just because a person talks slang from the streets, they're better entrepreneurs than your kids because they're out there making money. So they are business-minded people. They are hardworking people. They're just not given the opportunity, so they have to make their own way.
Exactly.
So
Some of the best mathematicians.
What you say? They know the numbers.
They know the numbers. I'm telling
you, street pharmacists are better than real pharmacists. They know the numbers.
They know the numbers. I've seen people count numbers faster than I could do it on my hands with a calculator because they know the numbers. And I say that to say that the reason as to why they have chosen this option is not because they don't want the opportunities, because they're not allotted or the opportunity, or they haven't been presented with these opportunities. And I hate that sometimes we're taught that people are just lazy and they're not taken advantage of. But I've seen people that lazy. Literally are fighting for the opportunity, but can't fund the opportunity. And because I can't fund it, the opportunity no longer exists.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you know what? Now, I know this is going to sound weird, but it is what it is. It's race matters. We have these hard conversations, but I see them opening up drug clinics and stuff like that, for addicts and stuff like that, right? In Camden, you know how many drug houses are in Camden where they let the drug addicts, back in the day, they used to let the drug addicts come to these certain houses and do their drugs because it was safer than in the street. So they let them come to these broke down houses and stuff, and they go in those houses and do their drugs. Well, now you're doing it. Now that the government can get a cut of it, now you're building those houses. Well, let the young men and women that were running the houses in the street run your building, because they've been doing it for years, trying to make sure people do their drugs and not die. Because, and I know this sounds sick and I'm not backing it, but they needed their clientele to stay alive. You know what I'm saying? And I'm not saying that to justify anything, but you got business people that if given the right opportunity to go to school and get educated and learn stuff, they would railroad the system, because they're brilliant. Absolutely. They don't have the means and the opportunities, and half the time they're trying to help their mom put food on the table, or or take care of their brothers and sisters. So you don't see that. You don't see them as family oriented, yet they're doing it because their mom can't put food on the table. They're doing it to give sneakers to their little brother to go to school, go to his middle school, because he's getting laughed at. So they're trying to take care of the family. So you don't understand the magnitude, because you don't want to find out and talk to them and find out the real reason they're doing it. You just look at them negatively. But Congress, you all have created this situation. Now you want to blame them.
Yeah.
You want to blame it on the victims. That's like telling a woman who was raped, well, it was your fault because you were in a bad area at the wrong time. So if you weren't there, you wouldn't have been raped. Well, you want to talk about these kids, but because of what you've done to them, this is what they've had to amount to. And now you want to blame the victims for being victims and victimizing.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
yeah, and how many ways will like free education lead to people then going and doing these things, and then they'll like be busy with school, right? So we don't provide things that could be constructive. So then, people are left with a lot of stressors and, hopeless about the future, which will increase the chances of, doing substances as a way of coping with their stressors. And I know some of the other arguments were around, like how about the people who didn't go to college because they couldn't afford to take loans and they were being smart about it, or are people being lazy and not wanting to pay their debt back? Egypt's reaction.
That's that to see, like, again, that comes from a level of privilege and a place of privilege. Because again, let's talk about some of the people that didn't go to college but ended up being successful. Okay. What opportunities were they presented because of the diaspora people that they come from? What opportunities did they get even from being in the elementary to a high school matriculation, that they met people, was able to navigate and understand what it means to network? But I might not have gotten the same opportunity in a charter school or public school. People's trajectory and the direction in which they go, you can't put everybody on the same playing field, especially when you don't understand a struggle that you can identify with. The opportunity that you may have gotten, the doors that may have opened for you, might have just been simply because of the color of your skin and had nothing to do with your ability. But I've been in places in the spaces where people didn't know my education level, but because of the hair that I have, it was a problem. So it's like when people say, "Oh, I know Steve Jobs didn't do this," and Tesla, what's his name, Elon Musk didn't do this. Okay, that's your 1 in a million.
Exactly.
But let's talk about the real statistics about how many other people that genuinely would like to have tried but didn't get a chance or opportunity, or just come from certain type of communities, again, where these education systems that are charter schools or sometimes in public schools don't have the funding to give them the proper education. I've been in charter schools where they don't even have textbooks. The books are printed out, and then you get upset when the kids are losing their books, but that's because they're all pieces of paper. But then you go to the school up the street or across the bridge, and they have iPads and MacBooks.
Yes.
So it's like you can't tell students across the world that they have an equal opportunity at education, but yet when you go into these schools and see what type of textbooks they have, the textbooks aren't equal. The environment isn't equal. The school lunch isn't equal. There's a lot of kids that can't focus in school because they didn't eat throughout the day. One of my students told me this, and this was a while ago. I was teaching in Philly. I don't want to give the school's name, but I remember having them write out like what they were going to do during their Christmas break. Well, we say holiday break to respect our religions. And one of those kids wrote, "I don't want to go home for break because I don't eat as much when I go home." From that day on, when I got to school after our break, I made sure that I brought him breakfast because I felt like he couldn't focus because he was so concentrated on, I gotta eat. So now I'm wired. Once he got his meal in the morning, he was so much more calm. And I think that these are the things that we miss when it's not your reality, including myself, because it wasn't my reality. My mom used to get a chance to make me breakfast in the morning, so I didn't know what that was like. But hearing him say that, I'm thinking he's looking forward to it. He's thinking, bro, I can't eat when I go home.
Yeah. And I even saw a teacher, let me rephrase that, a principal who actually, and it makes me want to cry, especially when you said that. It does something to you, inside, especially when you have a love for kids and stuff like that. It makes you want to cry. But he took a washer and dryer to his school. He bought appliances because some of the kids were being teased because they were dirty coming to school. But the parents weren't there to take care of them. And this principal bought a couple washers and dryers and told the students, if you come early, I'll help you, we'll wash your clothes. And he helped those kids because they had no other opportunity, whether their mother was an addict or whether she worked, whatever the situation. But the kids I am so sorry, y'all, but the kids were being, coming to school dirty, and they were being teased, and he was doing what he could to stop them from being talked about and teased. And I said, if you're in privileged areas, you can talk about our kids all you want. Our kids are survivors. They're doing things and still trying to get an education that your kids don't even respect. Some of your kids don't even appreciate the education they get, while we try to influence our kids to, you got to do your best because you're already behind.
Absolutely.
And you're not behind because you ain't got the education. You're behind just because of who you are. And it's hard to say I got to be the best, better than the rest, because I'm already behind the 8 ball. Because doing my best still won't get me hired when they see on the report that my name is Shaquana.
Right. And that's exactly what I was trying to say. Yeah.
But Leslie is going to get hired.
Exactly.
My education, I've done so much and worked so hard to have a wonderful education, and I'm so much more educated than Leslie.
Exactly.
But you saw Shaquana, and you said, put that in file F.
Exactly. Yeah.
So so go ahead.
No, right. So, this is where it goes back to like why this is important. And this doesn't even scratch the surface with $10,000. I think when it comes for people of color, it should be much, much higher than that. But that's the reality, right? And even when they are hired for the same position, Shaquana will also get less than Leslie and much more or less than John and, other white men that are in the same position. So you have more debt. It took you much, more effort to obtain that, and then you don't get paid the same amount.
And then the worst part is when you do get hired for a job and they say, "Wow, you're smart."
I'm sorry.
No,
I was going to say, and for those who may not believe that these type of things actually happen, look it up. Look up salaries at department heads and work your way down. See what the race is. See what the gender is, and see what the pay is. But the thing is, a lot of times we run from truth because the moment we have truth, we are now obligated to respond and react differently. And I think that for those people or persons who decide to remain ignorant, it's because facing truth in the face is a lot more challenging than to have to change who you've always been. And I'm hoping that from here on out, if you are watching this and you have struggled with what you think or you're hearing is untrue, look it up. Or if you ever want to have a conversation with me, my Instagram is EgyptAli_. I would love to be able to shed and talk to you more, to be able to get you to understand or get you to even empathize on some of the things that we go through as a community or as a minority within this country. And then on top of that, obviously, I'm a Black male. I can only imagine a Black woman and the things that they have to go through as well.
Ooh.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It's an emotional conversation, especially when you're fighting for your own kids and stuff. I don't have children, guys, don't get me wrong. But when I see my babies out there struggling and fighting and trying to get with just to get on the same level playing ground, and knowing that, they've got to work 3, 4, 5, 10 times harder than someone that is Caucasian, because they're seen when they show up on the scene, the questions are in people's minds and they look at the two faces, you know that it's going to be a struggle for you to get the position over the next person. So.
And then to hear what's been happening, right, in terms of conversations from the right, that like it's not deserved, this would be with other people's tax money, and all of these other conversations around.
And you should be grateful. I mean, that's another thing that happens. Well, you should be grateful that you're getting the education you're getting. Well, just because your kids are obligated or have the advantage and stuff, and just because your kids always had the upper hand, doesn't mean that I need to be grateful. I worked hard. This isn't a thing of gratitude. This is hard work, blood, sweat, and tears.
When people say that, it really bothers me, especially because, and again, I wasn't born or living during the slavery, but at the same time, that's like me telling them, you should be grateful for what we've built. Oh, you didn't know that we built it? How would America be what it is if we didn't actually do the labor that your ancestors weren't paying for, but they recouped the benefits from, and therefore they were able to finance certain things to be able to create these roads and be able to build these buildings. America wouldn't have the amount of wealth that it has acquired over the decades if it wasn't on the backs of Blacks. And I hate saying it like that because it's not just Black people, but at the same time, it's really true that when you look at how America started and what it became, you have to look it in the face, and you're going to get, I think Bill Cosby said, you're going to get a black eye. Not in metaphorically, because you're going to realize, Black people have contributed a lot more than what is being talked about. And because of that contribution, what do we get in return? We're not, and I'm not asking for anything that's unfair. I'm just asking for not just equality, but equity. Make it even. Make the opportunities balanced. And we got, how many times do we get to the line and you move it back? Because we haven't even talked about
Oh
redlining.
man.
We have redlining and how they utilized, property value, and it wasn't able to allowing us to take out certain loans. We haven't talked about how we got put into projects and the reason why the name projects it's a term intentionally. Like there's so many different reasons as to why we are set back and not looking for we're not looking for a handout, just the equal opportunity. So saying that we should be grateful when we've been, every time we get to the line and gets pushed back, is asinine.
Absolutely.
And like he said, we're not looking for a handout. We just want the same opportunities. We want you to treat us the way you want to be treated. We don't want nothing for free. We want you to treat you. When I walk in that door, I want you to see your daughter. I want you to give me that same opportunity, give me that same respect, and I heard somebody say one time, they were talking about, slavery and cotton picking and stuff. And they said, man, how they be calling black people lazy when they forced us to work for them for free because they were lazy. They didn't want to pick their own cotton, so they drug us over to this country, and then made us pick the cotton because they were too lazy to do it. They didn't want to do the labor, they didn't want to do the work, so they got it for free. So who's lazy for real? And I was like, man, I said that's funny. It's true, but it's funny.
No,
but
very much
when you look at it, it's like, listen, you didn't want to hire your own people because they want more money. So you get the ones that can do it free. So, and that's the mentality even today.
Exactly.
They'll hire me, but they'll only hire me because they can pay me $10 less than what they would hire the other young lady for. And then they might bring her in later on and then make me train her to give her a position above me.
That is, and unfortunately, and this is why I like the fact that it's race matters, because some things aren't just a black issue, it's a minority issue. Because even what you said just now, Rosie, it makes me think of like how a lot of people in the Hispanic community, in particular the Mexican community, because their labor is a lot cheaper or seemingly cheaper, they get hired in these construction jobs or these hard labor jobs. And that in turn is kind of like how slavery was. They're able to do labor for less, and the person who owns the business is able to acquire more equity. And again, this is a continuum of a situation that we ourselves have to grow out of, and instead of being dependent, become independent and cultivate those things within our own community. So then therefore now they have to come back and ask us for some assistance because there's a need. And I feel like if we continue to do what we're doing, they'll never feel that there's a need for us. We'll just we could just get another one. We could just get another one because if somebody else needs a job, if somebody else has to pay for their education or their kids to get. So we got to start trying to do for ourselves, and then in turn they'll create a new need for us to have to revisit this conversation. Now we can come to the table and demand certain things.
There you go. Preach.
And let me say this to the black people and the minorities that watch this show. When you run into a black minority, whether Hispanic or whatever, person that has their own, that is an entrepreneur and has their own business, pay them what they ask for.
Absolutely.
Stop trying to get over and say, well, why are you charging me so much? Because when you go to the other stores, the Asian stores, when you go to Walmart, you don't say, why are you charging me that much? When you go to the Asian stores, you don't ask them why y'all charging me that much. But soon as it's your brother and sister, you want to get a break. You want to ask them why they charge you. Just pay them what they're worth.
Absolutely.
Give each other the opportunity. Start sowing seeds into your own community when you see them really doing their best and working it. And don't get mad if their attitudes are different than if you went to Walmart, because they grew up in a community that's rough. So if they might sound rough, they're not being ignorant and disrespectful. They're just being natural because that's the community they grew up in. Support us, support your family, support your friends, and stop trying to get over. If they say it costs that much, pay it and give them a tip. Pay them and give them a tip.
And we please have to stop. See, what happens is, I think, Rosie, is that we start complaining about the quality of certain things.
Mm-hmm.
But because I don't have the financial back, I'm starting off somewhere. And the
Mhm.
quality ain't gonna be what it need to be right now. But understand, I'm trying. See, you want to get mad at me for trying, as opposed to if I did nothing, then you would call me lazy. But now that I'm trying, you don't want to pay me what I deserve, because it's a lot of hard work that goes into a template. But I can build on the template and make it what it needs to be. But if you would have saw Apple when it was in a warehouse or when it was in a garage,
Right.
you would have said, "Oh, well, I can't." But now look at it.
Mm-hmm.
It's called an investment. When you put income or equity into an investment, it's not what you want it to be when you first put the money into it. But when you watch it grow to what it can be, then the money becomes worth it and it doubles over.
Yeah.
So I think that we have to start looking at our community as an investment and be like, oh, well, I'm not doing that because they don't know how to spend money. Oh, I'm not doing that because the quality's not there. No, let me invest in them, and maybe they'll be able to get the machine to make better clothing. Maybe they'll get the machine to make better stitching. Maybe
Thank you.
it's so many different things that we could do, but if we don't believe in one another, we're not going to ever get there. So the
Right.
important thing, I think, that even from today's conversation is that we have to start investing in one another so that we can all grow and get to a place of independency, so that those, or the powers that be, can realize that without us, you can't operate.
Right.
So now we can control and have a seat at the table and have these conversations to make sure that we have a stance and can change our own outcome.
Absolutely. Yeah. And some people are benefiting from that narrative that it's not good quality, and it will continue to spread it, right? The people in power, which is why, part of, addressing these systemic issues is absolutely calling out the people in power and holding them accountable. And also, from individual level, saying we're going to stop with this and we're going to empower the people that, really need it and deserve it.
Right.
And that was a good point, I think, Egypt, to end with, because we can say so much more about these topics.
Yeah.
They're dear to us, and we're all passionate about them, and which is why we have this show, and we're excited to bring more topics. And with that in mind, friends, thank you for watching with us.
Yes.
Next week we won't be doing a show. We're taking a week off, but we will come back on the 14th of September with the topic of colorism and code switching, and we are excited for that conversation.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I can't wait to hear y'all's conversations on that. That's important.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Have a good night, Egypt. Have a good night, Mariana.
You too, Rosie.
We miss